The conference room on the 11th floor smelled like new carpet and recycled air. My son's wife, Amanda, sat at the head of the table, my table, the one I'd bought secondhand from a furniture liquidator in 2003 when Meridian had 4 employees and a leased warehouse on the south side of Charlotte. She had a folder open in front of her and her hands flat on either side of it, like she was steadying herself. I counted 9 seconds of silence before she spoke. I know it was 9 because I counted them. She said I had stolen $847,000 from my own company over 18 months. She said it clearly, without hesitation, the way people speak when they have rehearsed something long enough that it no longer sounds rehearsed. She named accounts. She named dates. She slid a printed summary across the table toward me with 2 fingers, as if she didn't want to touch it any longer than necessary. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at David. My son was sitting to her left. He was 32 years old and wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, charcoal gray, well fitted. He was looking at the window, not at me. At the window. The blinds were half open and the morning light came through in strips across the table. He didn't move. He didn't look up. His jaw was set in a way I recognized from when he was a boy and had already made up his mind about something. Roger Chen was standing near the door. Roger had managed this office for 11 years. He looked at the floor when I glanced at him. There was a security guard I didn't know positioned just outside the glass, visible through the partition, arms at his sides. That had been arranged in advance. I noted it. Amanda said my access card would be deactivated at close of business. She said it as a courtesy. I stood up. I picked up the summary she had pushed across the table and set it back in front of her, aligned with the edge of the folder. I looked at David one more time. He still didn't look up. I buttoned my jacket, walked past Roger, past the security guard, and stepped into the elevator. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The police were already coming. I had made sure of that 11 days ago. I founded Meridian Logistics in 2003 from a rented bedroom on the east side of Charlotte with a used laptop, a prepaid cell phone, and a laminated copy of my discharge papers from the Army Corps of Engineers. I was 37 years old. 15 years in the military had taught me how to move things under pressure, and when I came home, I understood one thing clearly. The logistics industry in the Southeast was fragmented, and someone with discipline and patience could build something real in it. I drove routes myself when I had to. I answered phones at midnight. By 2015, Meridian had moved into its own building on Westinghouse Boulevard with 22 employees and revenue that had crossed $8 million for the first time. I remember standing in the empty parking lot the morning before we moved in. It was November. The pavement was cold. I stood there for about 4 minutes, which is longer than it sounds when you are standing alone at 6 in the morning. Then I went inside and started setting up my desk. My wife, Carol, had been there for all of it. She had kept the household running during the years when there was no certainty any of it would amount to anything. She had her own way of communicating concern, which was to make coffee and sit across from me at the kitchen table until I talked. She died in April 2018, pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There was not enough time to finish any of the conversations we had started. David had been working at Meridian since he was 24, first in operations, then in client relations, then gradually taking on more of the day-to-day decisions as I stepped back. He was not perfect at the job, but he knew the company the way you only know something you have grown up inside of the names of the long-term drivers, the particular way the loading dock on the south side stuck in humid weather and needed to be lifted slightly before it would catch. He knew those things because I had shown them to him. One at a time, over years. In September 2020, I transferred 51% of Meridian's shares to his name. I told David over dinner at the restaurant on Providence Road, where Carol and I had celebrated every significant milestone since 1994. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Dad, I won't let you down." I believed him. I had no reason not to. Amanda Merritt started as Director of Finance in March 2022. She had a master's degree from UNC Charlotte and 3 years at a regional freight brokerage in Raleigh. She was good at her job, genuinely good. In her first month, she identified a billing error in our fuel surcharge calculations that had been costing us $11,000 per quarter for 2 years. She brought it to me directly, with a one-page summary and a proposed correction. I thanked her. I meant it. The change was gradual. David began arriving later. He began deferring decisions he had previously made without hesitation. In meetings, he would glance toward Amanda before responding to questions that had nothing to do with finance. Small things. Taken individually, they meant nothing. Taken together, over months, they told a different story. I started keeping notes, dates, observations, specific instances. I kept them in a plain notebook I had used for project tracking since 2009, and I added to it methodically, without urgency, without conclusion. By October of 2022, I had 23 entries. In April, I asked David about certain transfers directly. We were standing in the hallway outside his office. I asked him what vendor was receiving the reconciliation payments coded under operational overhead. He said, "It's for operational costs. Amanda handles the details." I told him I'd like to see the underlying invoices. He said he'd ask her to send them over. They never came. I was 37 years old. I had spent 15 years in the military learning how to move things, equipment, personnel, supplies across distances and under pressure. And when I came home, I understood one thing clearly. The logistics industry in the Southeast was fragmented and inefficient, and someone with discipline and patience could build something real in it. I did not have investors. I did not have a business school degree. I had a spreadsheet, a second-hand Ford F-150, and the habit of waking up at 0500 that the Army had given me and that I have never managed to lose. The first 3 years were not dramatic. They were just work. I drove routes myself when I had to. I answered phones at midnight. I learned the difference between a carrier who would hold when things got hard and one who would drop you the moment a better rate came along. I learned which contracts were worth fighting for and which ones would cost more than they paid. By 2006, I had 4 full-time employees and a small office in a shared building on Tyvala Road. By 2010, I had 14 employees and a client list that included 3 regional manufacturers and a national grocery distributor. By 2015, Meridian had moved into its own building, a 2-story commercial space on Westinghouse Boulevard, with 22 employees and a revenue line that had crossed $8 million for the first time. I remember standing in the empty parking lot the morning before we moved in. It was November. The pavement was cold, and the building's windows were dark. I stood there for about 4 minutes, which is longer than it sounds when you are standing alone in a parking lot at 6 in the morning. Then I went inside and started setting up my desk. My wife, Carol, had been there for all of it. She had kept the household running during the years when I was working 70 hours a week, when there was no certainty that any of it would amount to anything. She had never complained, not once, not in the way that registers as complaint. She had her own way of communicating concern, which was to make coffee and sit across from me at the kitchen table until I talked. I talked a great deal at that kitchen table between 2003 and 2010. She died in April 2018, pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. The speed of it was the hardest part. There was not enough time to finish any of the conversations we had started. David was 28 when his mother died. He had been working at Meridian since he was 24, first in operations, then in client relations, then gradually taking on more of the day-to-day management decisions as I stepped back from the operational side. He was not perfect at the job. He moved too fast on some decisions and too slowly on others, and he had a tendency to trust the most recent voice he had heard rather than the longest record. But he worked hard, and he knew the company the way you only know something you have grown up inside of the names of the long-term drivers, the quirks of the scheduling software we had used since 2008, the particular way the loading dock on the south side of the building stuck in humid weather and needed to be lifted slightly before it would catch. He knew those things because I had shown them to him, one at a time, over years. In September 2020, 2 months after David's 30th birthday, I transferred 51% of Meridian's shares to his name. It was a decision I had been thinking about for 2 years, and when I finally made it, I did not experience it as a loss. I experienced it as completion. The thing I had been building towards since 2003 was now going to outlast me in the hands of someone I trusted completely. I told our attorney, a man named Gerald Park, that David was ready. I told Roger Chen, who had been our office manager since 2012, the same thing. I told David himself over dinner at a restaurant on Providence Road, the same restaurant where Carol and I had celebrated every significant milestone since 1994. I ordered the same thing I always ordered. I told him what I had done and why. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, I won't let you down." I believed him. I had no reason not to. For the next 18 months, things ran well. David made some decisions I would not have made, but the company held and grew 46 employees by early 2022 revenue approaching $14 million. He hired competently, and he kept the client relationships that mattered. I remained in the office every day, still carrying the title of founder and senior advisor, still signing off on major contracts, still present. I did not hover. I had learned from watching other founders that hovering was a form of distrust, and distrust communicated to a son is a different kind of damage than distrust communicated to a stranger. In February 2022, David told me he wanted to hire a new head of finance. The position had been managed by a part-time contractor for 2 years, and he was right that we had grown beyond that arrangement. He mentioned Amanda Reeves, a woman he had been dating for 8 months. Who had a finance degree from NC State and 3 years of experience at a regional accounting firm. I told him I thought it was a reasonable idea. I told him to make sure the hire was based on her qualifications and that they set clear professional boundaries from the start. He nodded. He said, of course. She started in March. For the first several months, Amanda was diligent. She reorganized the accounts payable workflow in a way that genuinely improved our processing time. She asked intelligent questions in budget meetings. She was formal with the staff in a way that read as professional rather than cold. I had recommended her for the role because I believed she was capable, and for a time, the evidence supported that belief. The change was gradual enough that I did not register it as a single event, more as a series of small adjustments in temperature, the kind you only notice when you have been paying close attention for a long time. David began arriving later. He began deferring decisions he had previously made without hesitation. In meetings, he would glance toward Amanda before responding to questions that had nothing to do with finance. Small thing, the kind of things that taken individually mean nothing. Taken together over months, they told a different story. I did not say anything. I had learned, in the Army and afterward, that the worst time to act on incomplete information is the moment you first receive it. I started keeping notes, dates, observations, specific instances. I kept them in a plain notebook I had used for project tracking since 2009, and I added to it the way I had always added to it methodically, without urgency, without conclusion. I was not planning anything yet. I was only watching. I had given my son 51% of everything I had built. I thought he was ready. I was beginning to understand that I might have been wrong, not about who he was, but about what he was becoming, and what he was being helped to become. Those are different problems, and they require different responses. I was working out which one I was facing. Amanda Merritt started at Meridian on a Tuesday in March of 2022. She had a master's degree in finance from UNC Charlotte, 3 years of experience at a regional freight brokerage in Raleigh, and a way of entering a room that made you feel the room had been waiting for her. I noticed that immediately. I notice most things. It's a habit from 22 years in the Army, where the people who stopped noticing were the people who didn't come home. David brought her in for the CFO role. Chief Financial Officer was the title he wanted to give her, but I had suggested we start with Director of Finance and let the title grow with the responsibility. That was a reasonable position. And David agreed to it in the meeting, and Amanda smiled and said she understood completely. I believed her. For about 4 months, I believed most of what Amanda said. She was good at her job. I want to be precise about that because it matters. She understood numbers the way some people understand language, not just the grammar of them, but the rhythm, the way a figure in one column tells you something about a figure 3 columns over. In her first month, she identified a billing error in our fuel surcharge calculations that had been costing us roughly $11,000 per quarter for 2 years. She brought it to me directly, not to David, with a one-page summary and a proposed correction. I thanked her. I meant it. I told David his wife was sharp. He looked pleased in the way people look when they've been right about something and they know it. The first time I noticed a shift, it was small enough that I almost dismissed it. We were in the weekly operations meeting, the one I had run every Thursday at 9 in the morning since 2007, same conference room, same format, and Amanda raised a point about our driver scheduling software. She said the platform we used was outdated, that 3 of our competitors had already migrated to a newer system, and that the transition would likely pay for itself within 18 months. It was a sound argument. I said I'd look at the numbers. She nodded. 2 days later, David came to my office and presented the same proposal, almost word for word, as his own idea. He had a printout. He'd added a chart. I asked him when he'd done the analysis. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while. I didn't correct him. I wrote the date in my notebook and moved on. That happened again in April, and again in May. By June, I had 4 entries. The ideas themselves were not the issue. Some of them were genuinely useful. The issue was the pattern. Amanda would raise something in a meeting. I would respond with questions or concerns, and within 48 hours, David would return with the same position, but framed as his own conclusion. I began to understand that the meetings were not where the decisions were being made. The meetings were where the decisions were being announced. I did not raise this with David. I had learned, in the Army and in 30 years of running a business, that the most dangerous thing you can do when you suspect something is to move before you understand it fully. You reveal your position. You give the other side time to adjust. I was not ready to reveal my position. What I was doing was listening more carefully. Amanda had a way of phrasing things that I began to catalog. She never criticized me directly in front of others. What she did was more precise than that. She would say things like, "Your dad has built something incredible here, but logistics is changing so fast the platforms he learned on don't even exist anymore." Or, "I have so much respect for what Lucas did in the early years. This industry was completely different then." The compliment was always genuine enough that it couldn't be challenged. The qualification was always just sharp enough to land. She was smart. She knew exactly what she was doing. I had a conversation with Roger Chen in July. Roger had been my operations manager since 2011, a man who could tell you the status of any shipment in our system within 30 seconds and who had never, in 11 years, been late to a single meeting. We were eating lunch in the break room, which we did occasionally, and Roger said, without particular emphasis, that David had asked him to start routing certain vendor communications through Amanda's office before they came to me. I asked him which vendors. He told me. 2 of them were contracts I had personally negotiated. I thanked Roger and finished my sandwich. That afternoon, I called an attorney named Ellen Forsyth, who had handled Meridian's corporate work since 2008. I told her I wanted to understand the exact parameters of my position as a 49% minority shareholder. She asked if something had happened. I told her not yet. She said she'd pull the documents. By September, David had stopped asking me about major decisions before they were made. Not about everything. He still consulted me on operational questions, driver issues, equipment problems, but the financial decisions, the vendor relationships, the contract renewals, those had migrated somewhere else. I would find out about them in weekly reports, the same way any outside party would. I was still coming to the office every day. I was still signing documents that required my signature, but the architecture of the place had shifted around me, quietly, the way a building settles not all at once, but in increments too small to point to individually. I found out later, much later, that Amanda had been having separate conversations with David in the evenings. Not arguments, conversations, the kind that happen over dinner, in the car, in the particular privacy of a marriage where one person is very good at framing things and the other person loves them and wants to believe what they're being told. David told me some of this himself. afterward, when there was nothing left to protect. He said Amanda had told him that I didn't trust them, that I was holding on to control because I couldn't accept that the company had grown past what I could manage, that my loyalty was to the past and not to the future. He said she told him, "Your dad doesn't understand modern business. He doesn't trust us." He said it in a way that suggested he had believed it for a long time before he stopped believing it. I don't blame him entirely for believing it. She was his wife. She was in the room with him every night. I was a man who had always been better at building things than at talking about them, and if she told him I didn't trust him, she was working with material that had always been there. That is the part that stays with me most. Not what she did, what she found to work with. I kept adding to the notebook. By October of 2022, I had 23 entries. I was not planning anything yet. I was still watching, but I had called Ellen Forsyth twice more, and I had started keeping copies of certain documents in a folder at home rather than only in the office system. I had also started paying closer attention to the financial reports, not the summaries Amanda prepared for the Thursday meetings, but the raw data underneath them. I had access to that data. Nobody had taken it from me yet. I was using it the way I had always used information, carefully, quietly, and without announcing what I was looking for. The first transfer I noticed was on a Tuesday in March 2023. I was reviewing the raw data at 6:40 in the morning before anyone else had come into the building. The office was quiet enough that I could hear the HVAC system cycling on. The transfer was for $7,200 dated the previous Friday, coded under Operational Overhead Vendor Reconciliation. I had been running Meridian for 20 years. I knew what vendor reconciliation looked like. This wasn't it. I didn't say anything that morning. I wrote the amount, the date, and the reference code in the notebook and closed the file. Over the next 6 weeks, I found 9 more. They ranged from $5,000 to $900 or $800. Each one was coded differently: equipment maintenance, software licensing, regional compliance fees. Each one was just small enough to sit below the threshold that would trigger an automatic audit flag. Whoever had structured them knew the system. They knew it because I had explained it to Amanda myself 2 years earlier, when she was still asking questions and I was still answering them. In April, I asked David about the transfers directly. We were standing in the hallway outside his office, and I kept my voice even and my hands still. I asked him what vendor was receiving the reconciliation payments in March. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "It's for operational costs. Amanda handles the details." I told him I'd like to see the underlying invoices. He said he'd ask her to send them over. They never came. I didn't push. I didn't raise my voice. I wrote down the date of that conversation and went back to my office. That evening, I called Marcus Thompson. I had gotten his name from a retired federal prosecutor I'd served with at Fort Bragg in 1991, a man named Garrett Oakes, who had spent the last 15 years watching people try to hide money and fail at it. Marcus had been doing criminal defense and financial fraud work for 15 years. His office was in uptown Charlotte, on the 11th floor of a building I had driven past 100 times. I told him I needed a consultation and that I needed it to stay between us. He said that was standard. I drove to his office on a Thursday afternoon and told him what I had found. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "If you suspect fraud, we need evidence. Lots of it. Can you get me access to the financial records?" I told him I still had full access to the raw data. He said that was a start, but that financial records alone would not be enough, that we would need documentation of intent, and ideally, a witness who could speak to a pattern of behavior. He told me to keep recording, keep copying, and to do nothing that would alert anyone that I was looking. I drove back to Meridian and called Roger Chen into my office. Roger had been with me since 2012. He was the kind of man who showed up 15 minutes early and left 15 minutes late and never asked for recognition for either. I told him I wanted to upgrade the security cameras in the accounting suite, better resolution, better coverage. I told him it was to protect company assets. He nodded and said he'd coordinate with the security vendor. He didn't ask further questions. Roger had worked for me long enough to understand that when I offered a reason for something, it was the reason I was prepared to give, and that there might be others. The cameras were installed on a Wednesday. I have the invoice. The following week, I called Sarah Klein. She had resigned from Meridian in November of the previous year, 7 months after Amanda joined. I had always thought her departure was abrupt. She had given 2 weeks' notice and said only that she was pursuing other opportunities. I had accepted that at the time because I had no reason not to. Now I had a reason to ask differently. We met at a coffee shop on South Tryon Street, a Tuesday morning. Sarah was 28 years old and had the careful posture of someone who had been carrying something uncomfortable for a long time. I ordered coffee. I told her I was looking into some irregularities in the company's financial records and that I wanted to understand her decision to leave. She looked at her cup for a moment. Then she said, "Amanda asked me to delete records. Specific transaction entries going back to mid-2022. I told her I wouldn't do it. She told me that my continued employment depended on being a team player." Sarah paused. I gave my notice the next day. I asked her if she would be willing to put that in writing. She said she had already put it in an email to herself, dated the day it happened, sent from her personal account to her personal account with a subject line that read, "Record of conversation with A. Merritt. Read deletion request." She had kept it because she thought she might need it someday. I told her I appreciated her time. I paid for the coffee. I drove back to Meridian and called Marcus Thompson from the parking garage, 4 floors below street level, where the signal was weak enough that I had to press the phone hard against my ear to hear him clearly. I told him we had a witness. He said, "Good. Now we wait for them to give us something larger." I already suspected they would. The second week of May 2023 was warm in Charlotte. The kind of warm that comes before the real heat settles in pleasant enough that people leave their office windows cracked and forget to close them before they go home. I remember that detail because the window in the hallway outside the finance office was cracked the morning I reviewed the security footage, and I could hear traffic 6 floors below and a bird somewhere I couldn't see. I had installed the secondary camera system in January, 4 months earlier. Not the building's standard cameras, those fed to a monitor at the front desk that Roger Chen checked maybe twice a day. The secondary system was mine. 4 small units. I'd had a security consultant named Dale Pruitt Mount during a weekend when the office was empty. Dale had done contract work for a logistics firm I'd consulted with in 2019, and he knew how to place cameras so they caught what needed to be caught without drawing attention. I paid him in cash. I told him it was a precaution. He didn't ask against what. The footage from May 9th showed Amanda and a man named Marcus Reed entering the finance office at 7:14 in the morning. Marcus Reed had been with Meridian for 8 months. Amanda had hired him herself, which I had noted at the time and said nothing about. On the footage, Amanda unlocked the door with her own keycard. Marcus carried a laptop bag. They worked for 41 minutes. At one point, Amanda leaned over Marcus's shoulder and pointed at something on the screen, and Marcus nodded and typed. At 7:55, they left. Amanda locked the door behind her. Neither of them looked toward the camera. Dale had placed it well. I watched that footage 3 times. Then I checked my email. The message had been sent at 8:23 that same morning from my own business account, Lucas Merritt Meridian Logistics, com to First Piedmont Bank's Commercial Accounts Department. It was addressed to a woman named Christine Voss, who was the relationship manager for Meridian's primary operating account. The message requested an expedited wire transfer of $200,000 from Meridian's operating account to an account number I didn't recognize. The message was signed with my name. The formatting was correct. The account number it referenced was not one I had ever seen. I sat with that email for a long time. The coffee on my desk went cold. I drank it anyway. My password had been changed 3 weeks earlier. I had noticed the prompt and reset it, assumed it was a routine security cycle. I understood now that it hadn't been routine. Someone had accessed my account before I reset it. Someone had drafted that email and scheduled it, or sent it directly, and the timestamp showed 8:23, which was after Amanda and Marcus Reed had spent 41 minutes in the finance office with a laptop. I did not call the bank immediately. I did not call David. I did not walk down the hall and knock on Amanda's office door. I forwarded the email to my personal account, logged out of my work computer, and drove to a printing shop on South Tryon Street, where I printed both the email and 3 screenshots from the security footage. I put them in a manila envelope. I drove to Marcus Thompson's office on East Trade Street and sat across from him at the same table where we'd met 4 times before, and I set the envelope between us. Marcus was a corporate attorney, 61 years old, with 23 years of practice in North Carolina business law. He had represented me in 2 contract disputes and 1 property matter, and I had chosen him for this situation specifically because he was methodical in a way that matched how I thought. He opened the envelope. He looked at each page without speaking. He looked at the email twice, the way Judge Harlan would later look at a document, reading it once to understand it, then reading it again to confirm what he'd understood. He set everything down and folded his hands on the table. He said, "This is wire fraud. This is embezzlement. You have video placing them at the terminal before the email was sent, and you have the email itself from your account requesting the transfer. If the money moved, we have a completed transaction. If it didn't, we have an attempt." He paused. "Did the money move?" I told him I hadn't confirmed that yet. He said to confirm it before we did anything else. He told me to call Christine Voss at First Piedmont directly from a personal phone and ask whether the transfer had been processed. He told me not to use my business email for anything related to this conversation. I called Christine Voss from the parking garage of Marcus's building. She was cautious at first. She said she'd need to verify my identity before discussing account activity. I gave her the verification information she needed. She put me on hold for 4 minutes. When she came back, she told me the transfer request had been flagged by their fraud review system because the request came from a business account, but listed a personal account as the destination, and the amount exceeded the threshold for same-day processing without a secondary confirmation call. The transfer had not been completed. She asked if I wanted to speak with their fraud department. I told her I would follow up in writing. I thanked her and hung up. The money hadn't moved. That was the only piece of information that changed anything for me in those 2 weeks, not because it made what had happened less serious, but because it gave me time. If the money had already transferred, I would have had to move faster. With the transfer blocked, I had room to be careful. I had room to be complete. I went back to Marcus Thompson the following afternoon and told him the transfer had been stopped by the bank's own system. He said that changed the charge from completed wire fraud to attempted wire fraud, but that the evidence for intent was the same. He said, "You have video. You have the email from your account. You have a bank record of an attempted transfer to an account not registered to Meridian. What you need now is a police report because what you're describing is a criminal matter, not just a civil one, and you need law enforcement involved before this escalates further." I asked him what further escalation looked like. He said, "They try again, or they find another way to move the money, or they start working on a narrative that puts this on you, that you authorized this transfer and are now denying it to cover your own actions." He looked at me steadily. "Someone has already told employees in this company that you've been mismanaging funds. That narrative is already in circulation. If they build enough of it, a jury hears 2 stories and has to choose one." I had heard that narrative. I had heard it from 2 employees in separate conversations over the previous month, both of whom had come to me with something they thought I should know, both of whom had seemed uncomfortable repeating it. I had thanked them and said nothing about what I thought of it. I filed the report with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department on June 3rd, 2023. The detective assigned to the case was a man named James Morrison, 45 years old, Financial Crimes Division. I met with him for an hour and 40 minutes in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. I gave him the envelope I had prepared the security footage on a drive, the email printout, the bank's written confirmation that the transfer had been flagged and blocked, and a timeline I had written myself, dates, amounts, account numbers, names. Detective Morrison read the timeline without expression. He asked 3 questions. He asked whether I had notified David Merritt of any of this. I said no. He asked whether anyone at Meridian knew I had filed this report. I said no. He asked whether I intended to continue working at the company in the meantime. I said yes. He said, "Good. Don't change anything. Don't move money. Don't change access permissions. Don't alter your behavior in any way that would indicate you know what's happening. If they believe you don't know, they may continue, and continuation gives us more. I told him I understood. I drove back to Meridian that afternoon. I parked in my usual spot on the third level of the garage. I rode the elevator to the 6th floor. I walked past Roger Chen at the front desk. Roger, who had been with me for 11 years, who had watched this company grow from 12 employees to 46, who I suspected knew more than he'd said and was carrying it quietly. I nodded to him. He nodded back. I went to my office, sat down, and opened the quarterly review document I'd been working on before any of this started. David stopped by my office at 4:30 that afternoon. He asked how the Harmon Freight proposal was coming. I told him it was on track. He said Amanda thought they should push the presentation date back by a week to give the finance team more time to prepare the projections. I said that was reasonable. He seemed pleased that I agreed without discussion. He left. I watched him walk down the hall toward Amanda's office. He knocked twice, went in, and closed the door. I turned back to my screen. The quarterly document was open. The cursor was blinking. I had the evidence. I had filed the report. I had said nothing. I had one more thing to do, and that was wait not passively, not because I had no choice, but because I had made a calculation. David was my son. He was 32 years old. He had built something real at Meridian, whatever else had happened. I did not know yet how much of what Amanda had done was something he had participated in knowingly, and how much was something she had done while he looked in another direction. I wanted to know before anything became irreversible. I gave him the month of June. I watched. I waited. He did not stop. The email arrived on a Thursday morning in early August the 3rd. To be exact, it came from David's assistant, copied to the full company distribution list. The subject line read, "All hands meeting mandatory attendance, Friday 10, Sahar 0 a.m. No agenda. No explanation. I read it twice, then set my phone face down on my desk. I had been in the Army long enough to know what a mandatory all-hands meeting without an agenda meant. It meant someone had already decided what was going to happen. The meeting was not for discussion. It was for announcement. I called Marcus Webb, my attorney, at 8:47 that morning. He picked up on the second ring. I told him about the email. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Lucas, I think they're going to move first." I told him I thought so too. He said the warrant application was still being processed. Detective Morrison had submitted it the previous week, and the judge had it. It could come through any day. I told Marcus I understood. He said, "If they do something tomorrow, you need to let them. Don't stop it. Don't respond to it. Just let it happen." I told him I already knew that. He said he knew I did. I didn't sleep well that night. That is the only concession I will make to what I was feeling. I lay in the dark in the house I had shared with my wife for 21 years, and I looked at the ceiling. And I thought about David at 8 years old, sitting on the floor of what would eventually become the First Meridian office, a rented space on South Boulevard that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee while I sorted through paperwork. He used to bring his homework and spread it out on the floor next to my desk. He said he liked the sound of the stapler. I had not thought about that in years. I thought about it that night. I got up at 5:30, made coffee, and drove to the office at 7:15. I wanted to be there before anyone else. By 9:45, the conference room on the third floor was full. I counted 31 people from my seat near the back wall, 28 employees, and 3 faces I recognized as client representatives: Phil Garrett from Harmon Freight, a woman named Denise Caldwell from Trident Supply, and a man I didn't know who had arrived with Garrett. I noted that clients at an internal all-hands meeting, that was not standard. That was deliberate. David stood at the front of the room near the whiteboard. He was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, charcoal gray, well-fitted, and he had his hands in his pockets, which he always did when he was trying to appear relaxed and wasn't. Amanda sat to his right at the conference table, a folder open in front of her, a pen in her hand. She was not looking at me. She had not looked at me since I walked in. Roger Chen was standing near the door. He had been the office manager at Meridian for 11 years. He knew where every file was kept, which clients called on which days, and how my wife had taken her coffee during the 1 week she had come in to help us during a staffing crisis in 2014. He was standing near the door with his arms at his sides, and he was not looking at me either. His face had the particular stillness of a man who has been told to do something he does not want to do and has not yet found a way out of it. David waited until the room quieted, then cleared his throat. "I want to thank everyone for being here on short notice," he said, "and I want to thank Phil and Denise for making the time. What I have to share today is difficult, but it's necessary for the integrity of Meridian." He paused. He looked at the table. He looked at Amanda. He did not look at me. Over the past several weeks, our finance team has conducted an internal audit. What we found was significant. Another pause. We've discovered financial irregularities that go back at least 14 months, money moved without authorization, approvals that were falsified. He stopped again. Then, my father has been stealing from this company for months. He used our trust, my trust, this company's trust, your trust against us. Every account he touched, every relationship he managed, every decision he made in the last 18 months, we have to assume it was compromised. We trusted him completely, and he used that trust against us. He said it to the room, not to me. To the clients, to Phil Garrett, who was sitting 3 rows from the front with his hands flat on his knees. To Denise Caldwell, who had worked with Meridian since 2017. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed until the rehearsal became conviction. The room did not go silent immediately. There was a second, maybe 2, where the air just held. And then I heard someone near the front exhale, and someone else shift in their chair. And then it was quiet. 28 employees and 3 clients. I looked at the ceiling. There were 9 acoustic tiles visible from where I was sitting. I had never counted them before. Amanda stood up. She had a quality I had noticed from the beginning, a kind of organized precision that I had once mistaken for competence and had later understood was something different. She opened the folder in front of her and said, "We have documentation, transaction records, authorization trails, and third-party verification. We've already been in contact with our legal team, and we are pressing charges." She looked around the room, not at me, but at everyone else, sweeping the faces of the employees, landing briefly on Garrett and Caldwell. For the integrity of Meridian Logistics and for the protection of everyone in this room, Lucas Merritt is being removed from the premises effective immediately. She sat back down and closed the folder. I stood up. The room shifted. I felt it before I saw it. 31 people recalibrating, expecting something. Not sure what. Amanda looked up. David finally looked at me. I said, "I know." That was all. 2 words. Amanda's expression did not change immediately. She was too practiced for that. But her hands, which had been flat on the folder, moved. She picked up her pen, set it down, picked it up again. I said, "I filed the report 63 days ago. I've been waiting for this meeting." David said, "Dad." I walked to the door, not quickly, not away from anything. I opened it and stepped into the hallway. Detective Morrison was standing at the elevator bank with 2 uniformed officers. He had the warrant folded in his left hand. He looked at me. I nodded once. He walked past me into the conference room. I heard his voice behind me, clear and flat. "David Merritt and Amanda Merritt, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery." Phil Garrett stood up. He did it without a word, pushed his chair back, picked up the folder in front of him, and walked to the door. He did not look at David. He did not look at Amanda. He looked at Roger Chen as he passed, and Roger held the door open for him. Garrett's associate followed. Denise Caldwell from Trident Supply stayed in her seat another 10 seconds, then stood and left by the same door. She did not look back either. Amanda looked around the room. I know this because Roger told me afterward. In the specific way Roger tells things carefully, without editorializing. She looked at the account managers near the whiteboard. She looked at the 2 employees closest to her side of the table. No one moved toward her. Marcus Webb, who had been at Meridian for 6 years and had set his coffee cup down the moment Morrison spoke, looked at the floor. The woman beside him looked at her hands. Amanda's gaze moved across the room and found nothing to land on. A woman named Joelle Pratt. She had been our senior account coordinator for 4 years. Quiet, precise. The kind of person who remembered every client's preferred contact time, stood up from the far side of the table and crossed the room toward the hallway where I was standing. She stopped beside me. She said, quietly, "Mr. Merritt, what do you need from us?" Her voice was steady. She was asking a practical question, not a sentimental one. That was the right kind of question. I told her I'd be in tomorrow morning. She nodded and went back to her desk. I did not go back in. I had already done everything I needed to do in that room. I looked at David. He was still looking at the table. I had built this company in 2003 with $40,000 in savings and a second-hand truck. I had worked 20-hour days in the first 2 years. I had signed every lease, every contract, every client agreement for the first decade. I had given David his first title, his first salary increase, his first real responsibility, and then, in 2020, I had given him the majority share of everything I had spent 17 years building, because I loved him and I believed in him, and because his mother, in the last months of her life, had asked me to make sure he knew that. I did not say any of that. I did not say anything. Roger crossed the room toward me. He stopped about 2 feet away. He was looking at the floor between us. He said, quietly enough that only I could hear, "Lucas, I have to. They told me to call." He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. I looked at his face. He was 63 years old, and he had never, in 11 years, been asked to do anything that required him to look away from the person he was doing it to. He was looking away now. That told me everything I needed to know about what this moment was costing him. I put my hand on his arm briefly. I said, "It's all right, Roger." He looked up then, just for a second, and I saw something in his expression that I will not describe because it belongs to him. I stood up. I picked up the legal pad that was on the table in front of me. I had brought it out of habit, though I had written nothing on it. I looked at David one more time. He finally looked up. For approximately 2 seconds, we looked at each other across that conference room, over the heads of 28 people who had worked for me, some of them for a decade. He looked like a man who had told himself a story so many times that he had stopped being able to tell it apart from the truth. I recognized that. I had seen it in other men, in other circumstances, a long time ago. I did not speak to him. I turned and walked to the door. I counted my steps to the elevator, 47. I know because I counted them deliberately, the way I had learned to count things when I needed to stay controlled ceiling tiles, steps, seconds. The hallway was empty. Someone had thought to clear it, or perhaps people had simply stayed in the conference room. The elevator doors opened immediately when I pressed the button. I stepped inside. The doors closed. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I took it out. It was a text from Marcus Webb. It read, "The warrant is being executed. Police are at your house now. They'll be at the office in 15 minutes. You need to be out of the building." I read it once. I put the phone back in my pocket. The elevator reached the lobby. I walked through it without stopping past the front desk, where a young woman named Tara had worked for 3 years and who looked up as I passed but did not say anything. Past the glass doors, out into the August heat of Charlotte at 10:15 in the morning. My car was in the lot on the east side of the building. I got in. I adjusted the mirrors, which did not need adjusting. I sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel and looked at the entrance to the building. I had been in that building more than 5,000 times. I had unlocked the front door on the first morning of operations in 2003. I had sat in the lobby with my wife the afternoon she brought David in for a tour when he was 16, and she wanted him to understand where the money for his school fees came from. I had stood at the third-floor window the week after she died and watched the parking lot fill up with the cars of people who had come to work for something I had built. The August sun was hitting the windshield at a low angle. I turned on the air conditioning. I watched the entrance. I waited. I had filed the report with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department 63 days earlier. I had walked into the precinct on a Tuesday morning with a folder that contained 47 pages of documentation, bank transfer records, email threads, camera footage timestamps, and a signed statement from Sarah Klein, who had resigned from Meridian's accounting department 14 months ago and had been waiting, as she told me when I called her, for someone to ask the right questions. Detective James Morrison had taken the folder, read the first 12 pages in my presence, and looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. He said, "Mr. Merritt, this is going to take time to verify." I told him I understood. I told him I wasn't in a hurry. That was not entirely true, but patience is not the same as indifference. I had learned that distinction in the Army, in a different context, under different conditions. The principle holds. I sat in my car with the air conditioning running and watched the front entrance of the building I had opened 21 years ago. It was 2:17 in the afternoon. I had been asked to leave my own company at 12:04. I had not gone far. The first vehicle I recognized was an unmarked dark blue sedan that pulled into the visitor parking section at 2:22. Detective Morrison stepped out of the driver's side. Two uniformed officers came out of a second vehicle behind him. Morrison was wearing a jacket despite the August heat. He had a document in his hand, folded once, held at his side. He didn't look toward the parking lot. He walked directly to the entrance. I watched the glass doors open and close behind them. I did not move. I had already done everything I needed to do. What happened next was not mine to manage. It was mine to witness. Inside, from what Roger told me afterward in exact detail, because Roger Chen is a man who notices things, who has always noticed things, which is part of why I hired him 11 years ago. The three officers came through the lobby and took the elevator to the third floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who had been with the company 8 months, stood up from her desk. Morrison showed her the warrant. She sat back down slowly and did not say anything. David was in the conference room with two of the regional account managers going over the Harmon Freight contract revision. Amanda was in her office with the door 3/4 closed, which was how she preferred it. Morrison knocked twice and opened it the rest of the way. He asked both of them to come into the open area near the main cluster of workstations, where several employees were already watching from their desks. Roger was standing near the printer station when it happened. He told me later that he had been trying to finish a routing summary for the Asheville depot and had been standing there for less than 2 minutes. He said the moment Morrison spoke, the entire floor went quiet in a way that was different from ordinary quiet, the kind that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that something irreversible is occurring. Morrison said, "David Merritt and Amanda Merritt, you're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery." David's face, according to Roger, did not go through stages. It simply drained. The account managers he had been meeting with stepped back without being asked. One of them, Marcus Webb, who had been at Meridian for 6 years, set his coffee cup down on the nearest flat surface and did not pick it up again. Amanda said something. Roger could not hear the exact words from where he was standing, but her voice was controlled, almost steady, which he said was the part that stayed with him afterward. She was trying to negotiate a reality that had already ended. One of the uniformed officers moved to her left side. The second moved to her right. She stopped speaking. David did not speak at all. He was looking at the floor. The handcuffs went on in the open area of the third floor of Meridian Logistics, in front of 11 employees who had come to work that morning with no expectation of witnessing anything other than an ordinary Tuesday. Roger watched from the printer station. He told me his first coherent thought was not about David or Amanda. It was about me. About the moment 2 hours earlier when David had told him to call building security, and Roger had made that call, and I had walked out through the lobby without looking back. He said he felt the weight of that decision settle into him right there, next to the printer, while the handcuffs were being secured. Morrison looked around the floor and said, "Where's Lucas Merritt?" Roger said, "He's in the parking lot. His car." He pointed toward the window that faced the south lot. "He's been there." Morrison came to the window and looked out. I was still in my car. I had not moved. He could see me clearly. I was parked in the second row, driver's side facing the building, engine still running. He looked at me for a moment through the glass. Then he spoke to one of the uniformed officers and walked toward the elevator. He came out through the front entrance at 2:31. He crossed the parking lot and stopped at the driver's side of my car. I rolled down the window. He said, "Mr. Merritt, we need your statement. You filed the report. This is your company." I looked at him. Then I looked past him at the building. The third-floor windows were visible from where I was parked. I could see shapes moving behind the glass employees, officers, the ordinary aftermath of something that had been set in motion 63 days ago and had been set in motion, if I was honest with myself, long before that. I said, "I know. I've been waiting for this moment for 2 months." Morrison nodded once. He didn't seem surprised by the answer. He had read 47 pages of documentation. He understood the shape of what I had been doing. I turned off the engine and got out of the car. We went back into the building together. I had not been inside for 2 hours and 19 minutes, and the lobby looked exactly the same as it had when I left. Same tile, same light fixtures, same front desk with the Meridian logo on the wall behind it. I had chosen that logo. My wife had suggested the color. The elevator opened on 3, and the floor was still quiet in the way Roger had described. People were at their desks, but not working. They were watching. I recognized most of the faces. Some of them had been with the company for years. A few of them looked at me with expressions I did not try to interpret. I was not there for their expressions. I was there to give a statement and to sign whatever needed to be signed. David was near the elevator bank, standing between 2 officers, waiting. He was not in handcuffs, yet Morrison had apparently asked them to hold briefly while he retrieved me, some procedural consideration I didn't fully understand. When the elevator doors opened and David saw me step out, something moved across his face that I had not seen there in a long time. It was not anger. It was not the cold certainty he had worn when he told me to leave. It was something younger than that. Something that did not belong on a 32-year-old man standing in the company he had tried to take. He opened his mouth. I don't know what he intended to say. The officer to his left placed a hand on his arm, not roughly, just firmly, and they began walking him toward the elevator. He turned his head back toward me as they moved. I watched him go. I did not say anything. There was nothing I needed to say that the previous 63 days had not already said more clearly than I could. Amanda was brought out from the direction of her office a few minutes later. She walked steadily. Her posture was composed in a way that seemed like effort rather than ease. When she reached the point in the floor where I was standing with Morrison, she stopped. The officers let her stop. Briefly, she looked at me directly. She said, "This isn't over." I looked at her. I held her gaze for what I estimated was 4 or 5 seconds. Then I looked at Morrison, who was watching both of us without expression. I said nothing. I had nothing to add. The warrant in Morrison's jacket pocket, the 47 pages filed 63 days ago, the camera footage from the server room, Sarah Klein's 14 months of waiting, all of it had already spoken. Amanda was escorted to the elevator and then out through the lobby and into the second vehicle in the parking lot. I watched through the third-floor window. Roger came to stand beside me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Lucas, I'm sorry. About this morning." His voice was careful. He is not a man who apologizes easily, which is one of the reasons the apology meant something. I said, "You did what you were told to do, Roger." He said, "That's not the same as doing what was right." I looked at him. He was staring at the parking lot below, where the second vehicle was pulling out. I did not tell him he was wrong. Morrison spent the next 40 minutes with me in the small conference room on the second floor, the one with the scratched table that I had never gotten around to replacing. He went through the sequence of events in the order I had documented them. He asked clarifying questions. He was thorough and precise, and I answered everything directly. Sarah Klein's statement had already been verified. The email records had been pulled from the server. The bank transfer documentation had been matched against the forged authorization signatures by a forensic accountant Morrison's department had contracted. The case, he told me, was built. I asked him one question. I asked him whether my son had understood, when he signed the documents that Amanda had prepared, what exactly he was signing. Morrison looked at me for a moment before answering. He said the investigation suggested that David had been aware of the nature of the transfers, though the degree of his direct involvement versus Amanda's direction was something the prosecutor would work through. I nodded. I had expected that answer. I had been carrying it for 63 days. When Morrison left, I sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. The scratched table, the view of the parking lot, the sound of the building settling back into something that resembled its ordinary operations, though nothing about it was ordinary and would not be for some time. 41 employees still had jobs. The Harmon Freight contract was suspended pending legal review. Their attorney had called Meridian's general counsel within 90 minutes of the arrests, which meant word had moved fast through channels I had not anticipated. The Asheville Depot contract was intact. The rest would take time to assess. I picked up the folder Morrison had left with me, my copy of the filed documentation, stamped and returned. I straightened it on the table. Then I stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the parking lot one more time. The August sun had moved. The angle was different from when I had been sitting in my car 2 hours ago. The visitor spaces were empty now. The dark blue sedan was gone. I had built this company in 2003 with $340,000 in startup capital, a second-hand truck, and the knowledge that I was willing to work harder than anyone else in the room. I had built it because I wanted something to hand to my son. I had handed it to him in 2020 and believed, with the particular certainty of a man who has worked for 20 years toward a single goal, that I had done something right. I had been wrong about what I was handing it to, not about the company. About what my son had become in the years I wasn't watching closely enough. That was the part that sat in me now, heavier than the warrant, heavier than the 63 days of documentation, heavier than anything that had happened on the third floor this afternoon. I had built something worth protecting, and I had protected it. The cost of that protection was standing in the conference room with a scratched table and a stamped folder and the particular silence of a man who has done what needed to be done and cannot yet determine whether it was worth it. I walked out of the conference room, down the hallway, and back to my office, the one with my name still on the door, the one David had not thought to change, and sat down at my desk. I set the folder down in front of me. I did not open it. I looked at my hands for a moment, then at the window, then at the door. Outside, the building was beginning its slow return to the sound of ordinary work, keyboards, a phone ringing at the front desk, the elevator opening and closing, 41 people trying to understand what the afternoon had meant and what tomorrow would look like. I would tell them tomorrow. Tonight, I had nothing to say. The sentencing happened on a Thursday in October. I know it was a Thursday because I had a quarterly review scheduled that morning with the operations team, and I moved it to Friday without explaining why. I drove to the courthouse alone. I sat in the third row. I did not hire a victim's advocate or request a statement be read. My attorney, Carol Bynum, had asked me twice whether I wanted to address the court. I told her no, both times. David stood at the defense table in a gray suit I didn't recognize. He had lost weight. His hands were clasped in front of him on the table, and he kept his eyes forward, away from the gallery, away from me. Amanda stood at a separate table to his left, her attorney beside her. She looked smaller than I remembered. That was the only thought I had about her. Judge Patricia Owens, the same judge who had reviewed the emergency injunction 3 months earlier, the one who had signed the warrant that brought Detective Morrison through Meridian's front door, read the sentencing terms without pause. Wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. She sentenced David to 5 years in federal prison. She sentenced Amanda to 6. She noted for the record that Amanda had initiated the forgery scheme, had recruited the bookkeeping vendor, and had directed the destruction of the original ledger files. She noted that David had participated knowingly. She used the word knowingly twice. The fines were $500,000 each. When she finished, she set down the papers and looked at both of them for a moment. She said, "You had the trust of a man who built something from nothing and chose to share it with his family. That trust was not a weakness. It was a gift. You treated it as an opportunity." Then she closed the folder. I drove back to Charlotte in the same rain I'd driven through on the way down. I stopped at a gas station outside Pineville and bought a cup of coffee. It was bad coffee. I drank it in the parking lot, standing next to my truck, watching the rain come down on the highway. I stayed there for about 10 minutes. Then I got back in and drove to the office. The court's order regarding Meridian Logistics came down the following week. David's 51% staked the shares I had transferred to him on his 30th birthday, the ones I had signed over at the same notary office where Patricia had first noticed the discrepancies were seized and returned to the company as restitution. The court appointed a temporary administrator to oversee the transition. The administrator's name was Frank DeLuca, a man in his 60s who wore the same brown tie to every meeting and asked very precise questions about accounts receivable. I liked him immediately. Within 30 days, full operational control of Meridian Logistics returned to me. I did not celebrate. I sat at my desk that evening, the same desk, the same chair, the same window overlooking the loading dock where I had watched the first Meridian truck pull out 20 years ago, and I worked. There were contracts to review. There were vendors to contact. There were 41 people who needed to know that their paychecks were not going to stop. Harmon Freight called on a Wednesday. Their operations director, a man named Bill Sutherland who had worked with Meridian since 2009, said he was glad to hear my voice. He said he'd heard what happened. He said Harmon had no intention of moving their account. He said, "Lucas, we signed with you. Not the name on the door. I thanked him. I meant it. Carolina Logistics called 2 days later with the same message. Those two contracts alone represented $3.2 million in annual revenue. They stayed. Roger came to my office on a Monday morning, about 2 weeks after the sentencing. He knocked on the open door, which he'd never done before. He had always walked in. I told him to come in. He sat down across from me and put both hands on his knees and looked at me the way a man looks when he has practiced what he wants to say and is no longer sure it's enough. He said, "Mr. Merritt, I'm sorry, I didn't know." I looked at him. Roger Chen had been in this building for 11 years. He had helped me hire our first dispatcher. He had stayed late the night we lost the Caldwell contract to fix the routing system. He had called the police on me because a 32-year-old man and a 30-year-old woman had told him to, and because they had a piece of paper that said they had the authority, and because in that moment there was no visible reason to believe otherwise. I said, "I know you didn't. You did what you were told. It's okay." He nodded once, stood up, and went back to work. He has been here every day since. Sarah Klein came in the following Thursday. She had driven from Raleigh, where she'd been working as a contract accountant since she resigned from Meridian in the spring. She was 28 years old and had quit a stable job rather than delete records she knew were accurate, because a woman she worked for had told her the records were wrong and she had known they weren't. That took more courage than most people twice her age would have shown. She sat across from me and said, "I knew something was wrong. I'm glad you did the right thing." I said, "You did the right thing first. Thank you." She started back at Meridian the following Monday. I gave her the same title she'd had before and a salary adjustment that reflected what she should have been earning for the past 8 months. She did not make a speech about it. She sat down at her desk and got to work. That was the right response. The office settled back into its ordinary rhythm over the following weeks. Not quickly. There were awkward silences in the break room, conversations that stopped when I walked by, a collective uncertainty about what had happened and what it meant for the people who had been here through all of it. I didn't address it in a meeting. I didn't send a company-wide email. I just came in every morning, did the work, and let time do what time does. By December, the silences were shorter. By January, most of them were gone. The letter from David arrived on a Tuesday, about a month after the sentencing. It was handwritten, 4 pages, on lined paper. The handwriting was his. I recognized the way he formed his lowercase letters, the slight leftward slant he'd had since grade school. I read it at my desk, alone, with the door closed. He said he was sorry. He said he had told himself for a long time that he was making good decisions, that he was modernizing the company, that I was holding things back. He said Amanda had been very good at helping him believe those things. He said he understood now that he had been wrong, and that understanding it now, from where he was sitting, was a particular kind of painful that he hadn't expected. He said he knew I had given him everything: the shares, the title, the trust, and that he had treated all of it as something he was owed rather than something he had been given. He wrote, "You gave me everything, and I threw it away. I'm sorry, Dad." That was the last line on the last page. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and put it in the top drawer of my desk, under the copy of Meridian's original articles of incorporation, the ones I had filed in 2003, the ones with my wife's signature as witness, because she had been there the day I signed them, sitting in that same notary office, telling me it was going to work. I did not write back, not yet. I didn't know what I would say. I did not visit David in prison. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. It was not anger that kept me away. I had moved past anger sometime in the summer, in the weeks between the day I filed the report with Detective Morrison and the day the warrant came through, when I had sat with the weight of what was coming and made my peace with it. What kept me away was something quieter and harder, to name a need for distance that I could not yet close, a wound that required more time than I had given it. David was my son. He was also a man who had looked at everything I had built and decided it was his to take. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I had not yet found the place where I could hold them together and still walk through a prison door. Maybe I would get there. I didn't know. A year passed. Meridian continued to operate. We brought on 2 new regional clients in the spring. We upgraded the routing software in June, something I had been planning since 2021 and had been delayed by a series of decisions I no longer needed to revisit. Frank DeLuca stayed on as a part-time consultant, which I had not expected but was glad for. His questions about accounts receivable remained very precise. In the fall, I promoted a woman named Diane Cho to the role of Chief Operating Officer. Diane was 44, had been in logistics for 18 years, and had no interest in being anyone's successor or symbol. She wanted to run a clean operation with clear numbers and reliable partners. That was exactly what Meridian needed. I gave her the title and stayed out of her way. I began the process of stepping back from daily operations. Not all at once. I was not built for all at once, but gradually, meeting by meeting, decision by decision, I began to shift the weight onto people who were capable of carrying it and who had earned the right to try. I had built this company to last. I had always known I would not be here forever. What I had not planned for was the specific way the transition would arrive, not as a retirement party, not as a handshake with my son, but as a quiet reclamation on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room that smelled like recycled air. It was not the ending I had imagined. I was not sure it was an ending at all. On a Friday in November, I stayed late. The building had emptied by 6, and I sat at my desk in the particular silence that a building holds when the work has stopped for the day and the machines have gone quiet, and the only sound is the low hum of the HVAC and the occasional creak of the structure settling. I had always liked that silence. My wife used to say I stayed late because I couldn't leave well enough alone. She was not wrong. On the wall to my left, between the window and the filing cabinet, there was a photograph. It had been there for so long that I had stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing things that have always been in the same place. But that evening, I looked at it directly. It was a photograph from 1999. David was 10 years old. We were in the storage shed behind our house in Concord, building a workbench my design. His hands, both of us covered in sawdust. He was looking at the camera and laughing at something, and I was looking at him instead of the camera. My wife had taken the picture. She always said it was the most honest photograph she had ever taken of me because I didn't know she was watching. I looked at that boy in the photograph for a long time. I had done what I had to do. I had protected the company, the employees, the vendors who had trusted Meridian's name. I had given the evidence to the right people and let the system work. I had not acted in anger. I had not acted in haste. Every step I had taken had been deliberate and measured and, I believed, correct. And I had lost my son. Not to death, not to distance, to something slower and more complicated, to a series of choices he had made and a series of choices I had made in response, and to the space between us that had grown large enough to hold a prison and a year of silence and a 4-page letter that I had read twice and folded carefully and placed in a drawer. I did not know if that space would close. I hoped it would. That was the most honest thing I could say about it. I hoped, without certainty, that it would. I turned off the desk lamp. I picked up my keys. I looked at the photograph one more time, and then I walked out and pulled the door shut behind me. The hallway was dark. The elevator was waiting. I pressed the button for the ground floor and rode down alone. I took the photograph down from the wall. It had been there long enough that the paint behind it was a slightly different shade, a pale rectangle where the sun had never reached. I looked at it one more time. David at 10 years old, covered in sawdust, laughing at something just outside the frame, me looking at him instead of the camera. I opened the top drawer of my desk and took out his letter, 4 pages, lined paper, the slight leftward slant he'd had since grade school. I set the photograph on top of it. I closed the drawer. Then I turned off the lamp and walked out.